My name is Ava Sinclair. I had been away for 2 years on a long consulting contract in Seattle. I came home expecting quiet, dust, and the familiar creak of my grandmother's porch steps. Instead, I opened the door to my inherited house and found my brother sitting at my kitchen table like he owned the place. "You've been gone for 2 years," my brother Mark Sinclair said, not looking up from my kitchen table. "We didn't think you were coming back so soon." He was eating a bowl of cereal. My cereal. In my house. Using my grandmother's hand-painted bowl that she left to me specifically because she knew I was the only one who would not break it. I stood in the doorway of the house I inherited 18 months ago, rolling my carry-on behind me, still in airport clothes, and stared at the man I grew up with like he was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. Because in every way that mattered, that was exactly what he was. Mark did not apologize. He did not stand up. He just tilted his head toward the hallway like he was directing a rideshare driver and said, "Jenna set up your old room for the baby. The nursery stuff is everywhere. So watch your step." My old room. In my house. For his baby. I did not scream. I did not cry. I set my keys on the entryway table. The same table my grandmother kept her reading glasses on for 40 years. And I asked, very quietly, "Where is Mom?" Mark jerked his chin toward the back porch. "Out there. She wanted to be here when you got in." Of course she did. I found my mother, Carol Sinclair, standing in my backyard with a glass of iced tea, looking out at my grandmother's rose garden like she owned every square inch of it. She turned when she heard the sliding door open, and her face did something complicated. Not guilt. Never guilt with her. It was something closer to preemptive defense, like she had already rehearsed the argument and was ready to deliver it. "Before you say anything," she started. "How long?" I asked. She wrapped both hands around her glass. 7 months. 7 months. My brother and his wife had been living in my house for 7 months. They moved a crib into my bedroom, rearranged my furniture, ate my food, and slept under the roof my grandmother left me in her will. And they had done it for 7 months without a single phone call. "You were in Seattle," my mother said. "Like geography was the issue. You had that consulting contract. You weren't using the house. Mark and Jenna lost their apartment. And the baby was coming. And we just thought, for a few months, until they got back on their feet." "You thought you'd let them squat in my inheritance," I said. Her chin went up. "I thought family helps family. Your grandmother would have wanted—" "Don't," I said. Just that one word. Because we both knew my grandmother would have sooner torched the place than let Mark treat someone else's hard work like a resource to be mined. She built everything she had from nothing. And she had no patience for people who treated other people's effort like free fuel. I went back inside. The house was worse than I had let myself process in the first minute. There was a portable crib in the living room, surrounded by plastic toys. Mark's gaming setup had colonized the corner where my grandmother's reading chair used to be. The reading chair was gone. I did not ask where. I was not ready for that answer. The kitchen smelled like something had been left on the stove too long. Too many times. There was a film of grease on the exhaust hood that would have made my grandmother stare until someone cleaned it. Then Jenna Sinclair came downstairs while I was standing in the kitchen. She carried the baby on her hip and wore the look of someone who had rehearsed too. But her rehearsal was warmer, more strategic. She was going for sympathetic. She smiled and said, "We're so glad you made it back safely. The baby's been asking about you." The baby was 4 months old. The baby was not asking about anyone. "Jenna," I said, and I kept my voice professional. The voice I use in client meetings when someone tries to slip something past me in a contract. "I need you and Mark to find somewhere else to be by the end of the week." Her smile stayed exactly where it was. "That's not really possible right now. Mark's between jobs, and we can't qualify for an apartment without." "That is not my problem," I said. "It's your family. It's my house." She shifted the baby to her other hip, and her smile finally dropped. Underneath it was something harder. "Your mother said you'd be like this," she said. "She said you always put yourself first." And there it was. The preloaded narrative. The story they had already told themselves and each other. And probably every person who would listen. The one where I was selfish and cold. And the villain of my own home. They built that story over 7 months, so when I walked in the door, the weight of it would already be waiting for me. "I'm tired from traveling," I said. "We'll talk tomorrow." That night, I slept in my car. Not because I had to, because I needed to think. And I could not think clearly in that house with all of it pressing in on me. I drove to a parking lot a couple miles away, sat under a streetlight, opened my laptop, and treated my situation like a problem to be solved. Because that is what I do. I am a contract analyst. I read fine print for a living. And I knew something, Mark. Jenna and my mother did not know. They had no legal footing. None. They had never signed a lease. They had never paid rent. They had moved in on a verbal family arrangement brokered by my mother, which meant they were not tenants. In most places, the difference between a tenant and a licensee is the single most important distinction in a property dispute. A tenant has rights. A licensee has permission. And permission can be revoked. But I also knew what would happen if I just told them to leave. My mother would appear. There would be screaming and crying. Someone would mention the baby. Someone would invoke my grandmother like a weapon. The guilt machine would run at full capacity. And I would end up standing on my own porch again while they locked the door behind them. I wasn't doing this sloppily. So I built a trap. Clean. Legal. Quiet. Before you hear how I got them out without screaming, make a prediction. Comment guilt if you think they tried to weaponize the baby and shame me. Or comment lawyer if you think I handled it with paperwork and deadlines. The next morning I came back with coffee, a manila folder, and a demeanor so calm it unsettled my brother. He asked twice if I was okay. I sat at my kitchen table and said I'd been thinking. I understood that throwing them out immediately might feel chaotic. Family is family. I said, I get it. I knew you'd come around, my mother said. And the way she said it told me she thought she had won. She had arrived early, pouring herself coffee like the kitchen belonged to her. I told them I wanted to do things properly. No ambiguity, for everyone's protection. If something happened in the house, if there was an accident, if there was a fire, I needed documentation that showed the living arrangement clearly so homeowners' insurance wouldn't become a battlefield. My mother nodded. Procedure always comforts people like her, even when they are violating everything behind the procedure. Mark leaned toward the folder. What is that? A personal loan and occupancy agreement, I said. It formalizes that you're staying here as guests under a family arrangement, not a tenancy. It protects all of us. I watched Jenna's eyes move to the section on the first page labeled Benefits. No formal rent obligation during a transitional period. Utilities absorbed by the property owner. No credit check required. It looked generous to someone skimming for comfort. The lethal language lived deeper. It stated their occupancy was a revocable license at my sole discretion. Not tenancy. It stated occupancy required maintaining the property in documented condition and making no modifications. It stated I had access to the security monitoring systems. It stated any breach triggered termination and required them to vacate within 1 day or be treated as trespassers. Then came the clause I knew would matter most. They warranted they had no outstanding judgments or legal obligations that would affect lawful residency at that address. I had already run Mark's name through public records the night before. He had an active judgment from a former landlord for unpaid rent and property damage. The timing matched perfectly. It explained the sudden move. It explained the silence. It also meant Mark had just signed a document containing a lie. Mark signed without reading past the first page. Jenna signed because Mark signed. My mother witnessed it with a satisfied click of the pen. See, she said. This is how family handles things. I made copies and handed them their set. Then I smiled politely and said I had errands to run and would be out most of the day. They relaxed immediately, like people always do when they believe they've secured the ground under their feet. I drove straight to a hotel and checked in for 2 nights. Then I started making real calls. My first call was to a property attorney, Lena Brooks. A woman with the calm voice of someone who has seen every version of family entitlement and never once been impressed by it. I explained the situation. She paused, then said, "You got them to sign a license agreement, not a lease." "Correct," I said, "and they've already modified the property." My brother installed hardware in a bedroom and bolted a gate into studs. I said, "And the judgment clause?" "Active," I said. I heard the smallest sound from her, the closest thing to a laugh. "You can terminate the license," she said. They agreed to vacate within 1 day after notice. "I want 1 more day," I said. "I want to watch." Then I opened my security app. 2 years ago, after a neighborhood break-in, I installed cameras in the common areas. I never turned them off. They recorded quietly to cloud storage. Mark and Jenna never asked about them. People who think they own something don't look for the owner's eyes. Over the next day, I watched everything. Mark spent hours on his gaming setup, completely unbothered. Jenna video called her sister and casually described the situation as handled. She used the phrase "free house" and laughed. Mark didn't correct her. Then, mid-afternoon, a man I didn't recognize came to the back door. Jenna let him in. She walked him through my house. He measured a closet. He looked at the second bedroom like he was considering space. I sat very still in my hotel chair, watching my brother's wife show a stranger through my inherited home like she was lining up the next step. That was the moment I stopped giving them even a day of grace. I called Lena Brooks. "How fast can the notice go out?" I asked. "I can email it tonight," she said, "and deliver a physical copy in the morning." "Send it tonight," I said, "and I want you to contact Mark's former landlord's attorney. Let them know where Mark is currently residing." There was a pause. Then Lena said, "They'll be very easy to serve at a fixed address." "Yes," I said, "they will." Now be honest. If you were in my shoes and you saw them treating your inheritance like a free rental, what would you do next? Comment soft if you would give them more time to avoid drama. Or comment strict if you would enforce the deadline and take your house back immediately. The breach notice went out that evening. I know the timing because I watched Mark's phone light up on the kitchen counter. Watched him read, and watched his face change. Finally, he understood this wasn't going to be solved by my mother's speeches. He called my mother first. Then my mother called me repeatedly. I let every call go to voicemail. The next morning, 3 things happened in a sequence so clean it almost felt scripted. First, Mark got a call in the kitchen and went very still. The landlord's attorney. Second, a process server knocked and Jenna answered. She was served. Third, my mother arrived, probably expecting to talk everyone back from the ledge. But there was no ledge anymore. There was a signed agreement, a documented breach, an attorney, and a process server who had already done the job. I arrived around noon. I didn't knock. I had a key. My mother met me in the foyer with her arms crossed. Her face had moved past martyrdom into something raw, something close to the beginning of understanding. "You planned this," she said. "I protected my property," I said. "You set up your own family." "They moved into my house without my permission," I said. "They invited a stranger inside. They lied on a signed document. I enforced my rights. That's not a trap. That's a consequence." My mother didn't have an answer. For the first time in my adult life, I watched her not have an answer. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door closing on something that was never truly open. Mark stepped into the foyer looking like he hadn't slept. He started to speak, then stopped and stared at the floor. "We need a few days," he said. "You have until tomorrow morning," I said. "That's the one day you agreed to. I'll be back." "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Where were you going to go when you showed up here?" He didn't answer. Jenna came out holding the baby, eyes scanning for an angle that would still work. There wasn't one. I went outside to my grandmother's rose garden and stayed there for a while, pulling weeds along the fence line, touching something steady and real. They were gone early the next morning. I know because the cameras told me. I watched the last bag leave. I watched their car pull out. They left the garage door open. I closed it from my phone before I even left the hotel parking lot. My mother did not come to help them move. That told me something about the limits of her investment once consequences showed up. I spent days cleaning, not because the house was destroyed, but because I needed to reclaim every room with my own hands. I repainted the marks where the gate bolts had been. I had the carpets cleaned. And I found my grandmother's reading chair. It was shoved into the garage behind Mark's folded gaming desk. I carried it back inside and placed it exactly where it had always been. A few weeks later, my mother called. I answered. She said she wanted to understand how it got to this point. I told her I thought she understood exactly how. She said I had been cold. I told her I had been clear, and she had confused the two for most of my life. She tried to invoke my grandmother again. Grandma left me the house. I said. She knew me. She put my name on the deed for a reason. More silence. Different now. I'm changing the locks, I said. If you want a spare key, we can talk about what it means to have a key to someone's house, what that trust requires. She said she thought she could do that. I told her I hoped so. I didn't make promises. Neither did she. But for the first time in a long time, we were talking about the actual thing instead of talking around it. The locks were installed on a Tuesday. A smart system, the kind that logs every entry and exit. Not because I expected betrayal again. Because I learned something while my brother lived in my house without asking. Clarity is not cruelty. Knowing exactly who has access to what you have built is not selfishness. And the people who benefit most from your confusion about that distinction are always the first ones to call you cold when you finally get clear. That Tuesday evening, I sat in my grandmother's chair. The room was quiet in the way houses are quiet when they belong to someone. The rose garden was visible through the window. The reading lamp made a warm circle on the floor. My key sat on the entryway table. No one else's. The most powerful thing I did wasn't the agreement, the cameras, the attorney, or the process server. It was the decision I made alone in a dark parking lot. I did not owe my life to people who assumed it was theirs. That lesson doesn't arrive politely. You usually learn it standing outside your own front door while someone else turns the lock. But once you learn it, it stays. If you want more real stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one will hit even harder.